everyone, in this video, I'm going to talk about the repository structure in 61B. So first, before I kind of dive into the structure of different copies of repository you'll be working with in this class, I just kind of want to quickly define what a repository is. The repository, essentially, you can think of it as a folder in your computer that can help you store your code and keep track of multiple versions of the code. Okay, so first, there are two important repositories that I'll be interacting with a lot in this class. The first one is your personal repository. Let me list it down here. And this repository is where you will basically write all your code, and all the core staff, the auto grader, and yourself will have access to this repository. Okay, and the second repository that you'll be working with a lot is called the shared skeleton repository. And this repository is essentially where all the skeleton code for coding assignments will be released in the class. So now, knowing the different repository that you'll be working with in this class, I want to dive into where these repositories live. So the first thing is every student in this class have their own central bare repository that live in an instructional machines under the CS61B TA account. So let me draw it out in the diagram. So this box that I drew represents the instruction machine that lives somewhere in Soda. Okay, so there we have created for every single student their own central repository. So the auto grader, core staff, and yourself will have access to this central repository. So your central repository live here. Cool. So now having this central repository, usually it's very convenient to kind of develop code just on your local computer. And in order to do that, we need a copy and, or in another word, clone of our repository on our local computer for kind of easier coding development. So here, this is another place that you can kind of that your repository will live, and I'll name it to be, this is your local repo and clone one. Essentially, what this local repo is that I drew here is essentially a copy of the central repository that you have under the instructional machine. So in lab 1, you run the remote init git repo script in order to copy over the central repository to your local computer. So this box here represents your local computer or your laptop, okay? And in addition to that, remember that in lab 1, we have introduced a command that's called SSH, where you can SSH into the instruction machine using your CS61B account. So after you run SSH, you log into your CS61B, ****. Everyone has their own 3-digit login instructional account in order to log into instructional server. And there we have also tried to set up another copy of your repository there. So I will name this to be clone 2, just not to be confused with the other copy we have on our local computer. Okay, so this is also another place where you can kind of develop your code. And the reason why, so a lot of students ask, now that we have a repository copy in our local computer, why do we need to set up another copy of it in the instruction account? And the reason being is that the instructional server where you can log in through your instructional account has all the same kind of setup dependency that the auto grader uses to grade your code. So sometimes, usually it doesn't happen that much. If you see like discrepancy of running your code due to kind of some hardware or software dependencies on your local computer, a good way of testing your code is by SSH into the instructional account into this clone2 and make sure what the code you wrote is being pulled to this repository, and you test it on the instructional account under the same kind of setup or system or dependency that the autograder use, so that the result you get is kind of more consistent to the autograder result on the instructional account. Okay, this is not very like commonly used repository, but it's quite important if you kind of want to reproduce the autograder result accurately. You can SSH into it. Usually students don't have to do that. The local, we have tried really hard to make sure that whatever test you run on your local laptop will be what you get on the autograder results. Okay, but it's good to know. Cool, so now we know that we have these three places where we have our repository or copies our repository. Then how does code get transferred around between these three places? So there's something that we call or we use that's called Git. Essentially, the Git really helps you to track multiple versions of your code, track the whole history of your code editing, and helps you to kind of make sure that the repository or the copy of repository you have at different places is up to date. And in order to do that, there are a couple commands that we listed out on lab spec. You can read in more detail in the lab spec or the Git guide that we put under resources tab in order to know more in depth what these command does. But to summarize, in order to have all the code synced up between repository. So for example, I wrote some code in my local computer. Like for example, I wrote like 61b.java. And I want to kind of push it to the autograder, or so that on Grayscope or the autograder can run my code and make sure that I pass all the tests and I get kind of a score back to see how I did on my coding assignment. So in order to do that, in order to kind of like push my code to my central repository, I will run the following three commands: git add, whatever file you have, git commit. So this actually happens on your local computer. And after you add and commit, you do git push to the correct branch. And usually it's git push origin master. So at first, because Git is probably new to a lot of students, an analogy I like to use to kind of explain what git push does is you can think of it as you are now uploading photos on your phone to Google Photos on the cloud so that you can see it on the cloud and it will be stored there permanently. Okay, so this is what essentially kind of git push does: push all your code from your local computer up to the cloud, or in this case, the instruction machines where your central repository is. And sometimes when you have some code update on your central repository, in order to pull that code update down, what you would do is running the git pull command. Okay, so that essentially, using my analogy earlier, is you download your Google Photos to your local computer. It's kind of similar to that. So the similar thing happens between these two. If you want to pull your code from the central repository to the clone2 that lives on the instructional machine under your instructional account, you will run git pull. And sorry, here, if you want to update the code from your clone2 to the central repository, you also run the same command: git add your files, git commit -m with the commit message, and you do git push. Okay, so these are essentially kind of how these three repositories interact. And a common question that I get asked a lot by students in the past semester was that, well, I created some code in my local repository on my local computer, and then I SSH into my instructional account. Why don't I see the update in my code? Okay, so the reason is that when you update code in your clone 1, it doesn't automatically update in your clone 2 after you SSH into it. Because in order to update it, what you have to do is to commit your code in your local repository and then push it to your central repository up in the cloud, and then you SSH into your instructional account. And then after you log into your instructional account, you need to git pull to make sure that you fetch the latest update in your code. So you kind of need to sync it with the cloud. Okay. And after introducing this, your personal repository, which you will be working a lot this semester, I want to talk about another repository, which is the shared skeleton repository, which is where you get all the code for coding assignment. Okay, so that lives in the CS61B TAA instruction account on the instruction machine. So the shared skeleton repo lives here on the instruction machine. Okay, and this repository, students wouldn't have access to kind of modify the code changes there because that is where we kind of release coding assignment. But all the TAs and the professor have access to this skeleton repository and will maintain it and release assignment through this repository. And at the beginning of every single assignment in the future, you see the commands in order to pull the skeleton code. But essentially what you do is running git pull to kind of fetch the skeleton code from the shared skeleton repository and then have it down to your local computer so that you can start coding your assignment. And same thing here. Another kind of way to kind of fetch the assignment instead of running git pull is by running git fetch shared. So this fetch the code changes from the shared repository, and then you do git merge -m all the message. Okay, so we'll list this out, like the commands how to fetch your skeleton code to your local repository on this spec. But essentially, you can either run git pull or git fetch or git merge and git merge. Git fetch plus git merge in order to fetch the code release for your coding assignments. Okay, so hopefully this clarified all the different kinds of repository you'll be working with in this whole semester in 61B. Feel free to ask any questions on Piazza or ask TAs in lab if you have any more questions about these three repository. It's totally understandable that it is quite difficult to digest at first. So if you have any confusion, feel free to ask any TA about it. Thanks for watching.